For all of his talk about family values, he has fathered several children.
7, I think.
Who he has had no contact with.
Yes.
Hey everybody, Alex Cohen here. Welcome to the latest installation of the Inside the Issues podcast. Sara Sadhwani is away this week, but we have in her place the amazingly talented Ben Oreskes of the LA Times, who is covering, just about every national political, what are you covering these days? Everything, I feel like.
I'm the second hardest working person in show business after you, but covering state and national politics, running around like crazy, being everywhere like you, and having a lot of fun doing it.
Yes, I get to see you at debates all the time, but I decided that wasn't enough, so I brought you here so that we could talk about what actually happens inside the press room or when journalists are watching these Senate debates and candidate forums that are playing out. We're also going to talk about presidential candidates and presidents coming here to Southern California. In 1 week, not only did we see horrific amounts of rain, we also saw President Biden showing up in time for the Grammys. We saw Nikki Haley in Orange County, in Hollywood. So that is what is on the agenda, Ben. But I figured we'd start off with the U.S. Senate race, because that's actually where I saw you last time in person at the USC candidate debate that happened back in January. And I don't know if you saw this. Did you see the newest, I think this is the hot off the presses, freshest poll from USC Dornsife. It was taken over a window of time after that debate. It finds now that Adam Schiff leading, as he has been in many of these polls, at 25%. But now Katie Porter and Steve Garvey tied at 15%, Barbara Lee at 7%. And remember, before, it was kind of like looking like a Schiff-Garvey race. What do you think is going on with Katie Porter now kind of inching up in the polls a bit?
I think the most important point to make here is that the comparative dominance of Adam Schiff. He has the most money, the most star power. We'll talk about that in a sec. And the most popularity. And so we've entered a race for second place. And that is Steve Garvey, former Dodger, former Padre, Mr. Popeye, or whatever they called his forearms, against Katie Porter, this Irvine congresswoman who herself has a lot of star power, has been in the race for over a year. Garvey comes in, in October officially. And I think what you're seeing is people sort of waking up to the stakes. And we have Porter, who has quite a bit of money herself. Yeah. She has about $13 million. That's how much she had raised or had on hand by the end of 2023. And that money is being put to good use right now. If you're watching YouTube TV, if you're watching cable, you are seeing her on the air. Everywhere. Almost as much as Adam Schiff, but not as much. He has a lot more money. And I think as a result, her sort of popularity is kind of solidifying. And with Garvey, I think there was a huge boost as he came into the race and got earned media. He was on the front page of the LA Times. He had big stories about him in Politico. He was at that debate that we both saw each other at.
Did that help him or hurt him, that debate?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure, because he spent the entire time getting beat up by Democrats in a very partisan way. So you have to think about, what is Garvey trying to do right now? He's trying to solidify the support of the small but not insignificant Republicans in the state. So if they watch him get beat up by a person they hate like Adam Schiff, maybe it makes them like him more. And so maybe it did help him. I talked to a lot of people who watched it and liked how he looked on TV, even if they didn't really hear much substantive from him. And that was kind of the takeaway from the debate. Yeah. But
there were some groans in that media room when he talked about talking about his vote for Trump was banging on the cans like the Astros. I mean, there were some audible,
and weird lines and a real sort of recognition that there's not a lot of substance behind his candidacy. I was with him in San Diego the week before that, or 2 weeks before that. And I asked him, when can we expect to hear anything about policy from you, particularly about homelessness? We were standing in the shadow of a big shelter there. Yeah. And he said, call me after the primary, essentially. And I think that voters in this state, particularly on an issue like housing and homelessness, are very smart and do want to hear from their candidates something that kind of is real and can speak to their frustration about that. At the same time, I think their, Republican registration in the state's about 22%. Mm-hmm. I think his goal right now is consolidating that chunk of votes. And if he can, he's very competitive and could make this runoff. I still think that the money that Katie Porter has and the ability she has to run ads from now until Election Day, it gives her a huge advantage. But there's one thing we haven't talked about, which is Adam Schiff's ads about this whole moment, which are wild.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of there's an ad and a video.
Yes.
And there is a distinction. So there is an ad that he put out called Two Visions that really made it look like we were in the general election primaries that happened and Steve Garvey had won. And I have talked to a lot of people in the business of politics, outside the business of politics about this. I think there was a piece in the LA Times about like, whoa, right? Like, you can't fast forward to the general, buddy. But a lot of people are saying this is an incredibly shrewd political strategy. You make it a fight about these two. I mean, it's kind of like Donald Trump just pretending it's a general election right now. It makes sense.
And it's partially about the idiosyncrasy of voting in California, where you have these top two primaries that are nonpartisan. You know, Democrats can vote for whoever they want. Republicans can vote for whoever they want. It's different than a presidential primary. And it allows for some strategy, and we've seen it before. We've seen it in governor's races. We've seen it in attorney general's races, where the person who's sort of in the catbird seat kind of tries to target and lift up the person who they want. And a lot of people, including Katie Porter, call it cynical. Yeah. And they kind of say it disenfranchises voters. I think it's your money. You get to spend it how you want. And there's a strategy behind it. And so just to break it down, this ad that you're talking about, it pretends like Katie Porter doesn't exist. It talks about Garvey's support of Trump, and it talks about how he's too conservative for California.
Yeah.
Back to that 22% of registered Republicans. Yeah. That's maybe what they want to hear. And because we don't know exactly how much Schiff has spent on this ad, but the campaign has told me millions of dollars. So that ad is running everywhere. They're also putting it on mailers. I talked to a Republican member of the Assembly from, I think, Tulare County, wherever Rockland is. But this is my geography right now. Is
northern.
Yeah. But he told me he got a piece of mail from Adam Schiff. First time, he's a registered Republican. First time in his life he's gotten a piece of mail from a Democrat. But it was all about Garvey. And again, it sort of speaks to this, like, they want a guy like that to see this and say, well, I'm not going to vote for Adam Schiff. I'm going to vote for the other guy.
Right.
And that other person is not Katie Porter, it's Steve Garvey.
And then just to like spell it all out and connect the dots, it helps Schiff because if he's facing Garvey in a general election, all the folks who might have voted for Barbara Lee or for Katie Porter, of those two will likely vote for him. But wait, there's more. Hot off the presses is it's a video, not an ad, that Adam Schiff put out, narrated by the actor Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And let's take a bit of a listen to that new video that's out about Adam Schiff.
Whether you're dropping your kids off at school before the workday starts, or you're punching out as the sun is rising, these stories are California stories. Hard-working people are building a better life for themselves and their kids.
You're doing just most incredible work.
All right, Ben, you've watched it. What first came to mind for you?
A little bit of an eye roll. I said to my colleagues after watching it that it felt like the Adam Schiff team had entered their USC film school era of ad making. It's certainly something that feels like it was made to go viral. Like they're trying to, again, remember, Adam Schiff is the congressman of Hollywood. He has these connections into that community that are deep. IATSE, he was on the SAG-AFTRA picket line. He knows these people. He knows Mr. Gordon-Levitt, and they know him. I think this is, again, sort of about his national appeal.
Yeah.
Because of his work on the Intel Committee, because of his work on impeachment, he's known to people for some specific things, and he's trying to leverage that.
But the ad itself is like old pictures of Adam Schiff back in the day, and it's really stressing, like, Dad was an insurance salesman.
He's a man of the people.
School. Yes. Have you watched the Amazon show Jury Duty?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And you know how James Marsden is working on his, like, I'm a real blue-collar guy? when I listened to Joseph Gordon-Levitt reading that, all I could picture was James Martin. Like, I'm a man of the people. And
the photo of Schiff as a hotshot firefighter. Yeah. It was rarely something, again, because of this image we have of him as the lawyer or the prosecutor. Yeah. They're trying to, soften out some edges. I mean, I think it stands in stark contrast to a Katie Porter who's so about authenticity, so about the minivan, so about being a single mom, which is not a cynical thing. She really is that, but has used that and it to great effect in terms of how she presents herself nationally.
Yeah. And you wrote about that, Ben. And I texted you that morning when I read that piece. I thought it was great because for someone who is not a parent and certainly not a mom, you captured that essence. And there were some, forgive me, I should have pulled the actual quote from it. But I really got the sense of the tension that she faces as a person in trying to balance this career. Like, it's not just a political selling point. It's also kind of it felt like an existential crisis for her. Is that going too far, do you feel like?
I don't think so. I mean, I hope everyone goes and reads it. But my favorite moment was I went to her home and sat with her kids. And her daughter, her youngest daughter, Betsy, named after Elizabeth Warren, her mentor, or Katie Porter's mentor, said to me, I kind of hope my mom loses so I can get a cat. And of course, that was a joke in many ways, but
probably not in other ways.
Yeah. And Katie Porter's life, they all live on airplanes. They're moving back and forth. But much of Katie Porter's argument about being in Congress is that Congress is not made for people like her. Yeah. It's made for rich people. It's made for white men who have wives or babysitters. And her life in some ways, while being completely real, is like this performance piece to explain and show how this whole thing is not set up for her to succeed. And she's trying to try to prove the haters wrong, I think. She also uses that in many respects to explain away why many of her colleagues don't like her. She says, can I curse on this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely.
She says, I don't have time for the bullshit and says things like that. A lot of her colleagues, she has one member of the California delegation who has endorsed her. All the others have endorsed Lee and Porter, or Lee and Schiff. And her view of that is, I'm too busy. I'm not trying to play these games.
I'm doing the work.
Exactly. I think the truth exists somewhere in between this. Yeah. Her personality is very unique and she is brusque. But she really does have this very unique life in Congress that's worth spotlighting for that reason.
Let's talk about a madre and a padre, because another great piece that came out in the LA Times this week about Steve Garvey points out for all of his talk about family values, he has fathered several children.
7, I think.
Who he has had no contact with.
Yes.
I mean, and there's one story about one of the kids who had a chance encounter with him in a ski resort, and he literally wouldn't talk to the kid. Yeah. I mean, and that, for someone who's saying I'm all about family values, again, I don't know how many people are reading that piece or watching the debate and having a change of heart about Steve Garvey, but it was, there's that race alone. We've spent so much of this episode talking about it, and there's still so much more we could. It's a fascinating race.
There are real choices to be made. A shout out to Nathan Fenno and Adam Elmark who wrote that story. Yeah. Again, Steve Garvey was a sort of national punchline in the late 80s and early 90s for these kids who he had out of wedlock. I think the story also noted a string of bad businesses, filching on loans, the reality of him. Again, to your point of does this break through? We're living in a world where a person who has been indicted on 91 different counts is running for president. I don't know that it matters, but it certainly is something that kind of counters the image he's trying to present to Californians right now. But it's a great race to cover and really fun to watch. I think the next 3 or 4 weeks are going to be wild because everything is on the line right now. If, as you said earlier, if Garvey makes the runoff, it's kind of over just given the huge number of Democrats in the state. So I think you're going to see Katie Porter really go for it. And we're kind of looking to see how Steve Garvey is what he's going to do for the next couple of weeks because he doesn't have that money. He's got to kind of
touch homeless people, which is a little reference if you watch that debate.
Yes.
You'll get. If not, Go watch it. And hopefully next week, there's a little gem of a nugget about that race that I can't even share with you right now, Ben. But tune in next week where I should be able to share. But I do want to cliffhanger. Yes, I do want to pivot and talk about the big kahuna of them all, the presidential race. And having covered politics in California for so long, California's the ATM. California doesn't really matter because the Democratic candidate always wins, blah, 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 blah. And I feel like California is playing such a pivotal role in the presidential race. While Joe Biden's first in the nation South Carolina Democratic primary was happening, he was not in that SC. He was in SoCal. Knowing that it was the Grammy weekends, he and the First Lady came out here. And I just thought it was this fascinating trip, kind of announced at the last minute, under the cover of night. Yeah. It felt like they come out here to LAX. They're greeted by Alex Padilla and his son Diego. Yeah. Even though Alex Padilla kind of pissed with him about what's going on with immigration. Maxine Waters is there with her daughter. And then they split up. Joe Biden goes to a group called the 15% Institute, and they're saying Black Americans make up 15% of the population. Stores should allow us 15% of the shelf space, and really was talking about, like, Joe Biden has been there for you. And she's doing that because a lot of Black voters do not feel like Joe Biden has been a great partner. There's a big piece out in the New York Times talking about how pastors across the country feel like he's really messing it up when it comes to the war in the Middle East, and they're kind of losing their faith there. We're also hearing Black voters say, hey, we thought all this stuff was going to happen on student debt, and that kind of hasn't panned out. And you look at the economy, and I'm not really feeling great right now. So I think there's real fear for the Biden campaign that it may not work out for him. Yeah.
I would point out one thing else happened this weekend. Yeah. It was Hunter Biden's 54th birthday, and they, this is Joe Biden, the family man. And I want to just plug one more thing. My colleague Matt Hamilton and Stacey Perman wrote this big article about Hunter's life in L.A. And more specifically, how his life is sort of bankrolled by a very important Hollywood lawyer. And I mentioned that.
That's such a great piece.
Yeah, and I mentioned that because it also underscores that, the tentacles, the sort of centrifugal forces that pull people to California and the power that is here. I mean, Hunter Biden is living in Malibu. I mean, the president's son is here and dealing with all these legal challenges and, attacks from Republicans in D.C., and yet he is living this quiet life here. To what you were saying about Jill being here for this event, I think there's two key points that came from that for me. One is about money. They're going to be doing a lot of fundraising here. We can talk about that. But also just this need for having validators, people who can go out into the country, whether it's Gavin Newsom or Magic Johnson or whoever, and speak, preach the gospel of Joe Biden. And we have seen sort of data coming in from South Carolina where not that many people voted in that primary. Obviously, the stakes were low. But any amount of sort of ambivalence, negativity on the part of Black voters who we know are a huge part of his coalition is trouble for him going forward.
I actually, just before Biden touched down here, I wanted to check in with another great political voice here in L.A., Dr. Nee Cordelay-Corte. He's host of a show called A More Perfect Union on KBLA. And, he was talking about this. I just want you to take a listen to what he said. I was really struck by his use of the word when talking about Trump versus Biden, bewilderment versus pragmatism. Take a listen.
I think for the Black community and perhaps for other constituencies, oftentimes we lean into our pragmatism, even in the face of our bewilderment. And I think this president and vice president are betting that in a race against Donald Trump, folks are going to lean into that pragmatism. But it's that bewilderment that may keep people from showing up.
And that's a central part of the quiet argument made by a lot of Biden surrogates and supporters. Again, though, I come back to this moment. I was at the California Democratic Convention in the fall, and there are these huge protests about the war in Gaza and what many people call a genocide there, which is a very contested idea. But I met this young voter from the Bay Area. She was 18. She was so inspiring. And she goes, I'm so excited to vote for Cornel West. And she said it without any irony.
Yeah.
And you know, again, the margins in these races are so tight, not in California, but in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, Arizona, all these states. And you have huge Muslim communities, Arab American communities in Dearborn, in Michigan. You have huge Jewish communities in the suburbs of Philadelphia. If any of, or in Pittsburgh, if any of these people say, I'm not voting, we're talking 10,000, 20,000 votes that could swing this election.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. It's a nickel and dime kind of situation. Well, I think that's a perfect segue to talk about another presidential candidate who was in the region this week, Nikki Haley. So she swung into town, in no small part bankrolled by a guy named Tim Draper. A great episode of the New York Times, The Daily. If you haven't checked it out, Tim Draper, basically a very rich venture capitalist, you know, money goes way back in the money, and a guy who's like taken big bets on technology and it's panned out for him. He's also taken some political bets. Back in the day, you might recall Tim Draper launched the Let's Split California into 6 Californias. That didn't turn out too well.
Or made much sense, I think, in terms of how they'd accomplish it.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe a lot of folks are looking at him saying, why are you investing so much in Nikki Haley? I think between her and her super PACs, it's well over $1 million, maybe somewhere around $2 million. And so Nikki Haley comes into town to try to court more of that financial support, right? And to, you know, California, because of the new rules this year, the GOP, under the persuasion of the Trump campaign, has decided that, you know, you get more than 50% of the vote. In the Republican vote on Super Tuesday, you get all of our 169 delegates. So trying to woo voters here. So she shows up in Orange County. She's at a bar in Costa Mesa. I think it's called the Wild Goose Tavern, named after John Wayne's yacht. And then, you know, she heads on over to Hollywood that night. And I think that poor woman must be working round the clock because she shows up at the Hollywood American Legion Post 43, this beautiful Art Deco venue just down the road from the Bowl. The crowd's there. They've got their Nikki Haley signs. And she says, it's so great to be back in Orange County. And it was such a, no moment. So, oh my God, I'm so tired.
Pothole,
sorry.
Stepping in that pothole on San Vicente.
Exactly. But, you know, then, you know, got it back and got back into those talking points we've heard over and over again. She mentioned nothing about the pretty stunning defeat to none of the above.
Nevada was wild to watch that happen.
Oh, yeah. And again, this is a little bit insider baseball, but Trump not on the ballot until the caucuses this week. On the primary, people who didn't like Nikki Haley could vote for none of the above, and she was trounced by that. She says that election was rigged. So many people say things are rigged. I don't know if rigged has
I think it sort of underscores the hopelessness of the mission that Nikki Haley is on, this kind of You literally are running against no one and you can't even win in that moment. And then you look at what's going to happen in California in a month when the Republican primary happens here. That will probably be the moment that coronates Trump as the official nominee. I can't remember the exact amount of delegates he needs to win the nomination, but many pundits think that's when he'll reach it.
Yeah.
Again, there's just this journey that a person like Haley has been on where she sort of criticizes Trump, but then is asked about, you know, these cases with Jean Carroll in New York and won't really talk about his, you know, problems or, you know, with women or the corruption that surrounds him. And you're kind of wondering, like, if you're going to go there kind of thing.
Right. You know what? It's funny. I've never thought of it this way until I just heard you say this, Ben. So I used to live in San Francisco. People in San Francisco hate LA with a passion. Yeah. They hate us. And people in LA are like completely clueless about it, right? And it's not a two-way street. Donald Trump has come out so hard after Nikki Haley, as to San Franciscans, talking about people in LA. And Haley, you're right, like just doesn't go back on that same attack. I actually want to play a clip because the funny thing is that the case that she is making against him is pretty lodged in a very true reality. Let's take a look at what she had to say about Donald Trump and what he's been doing in recent weeks.
The problem that I have with what happened in New Hampshire or what happened after the court case was at no point did he ever talk about the American people. At no point did he talk about our debt. At no point did he talk about the fact that only 31% of eighth graders in our country are proficient in reading. At no point did he talk about the open borders. At no point did he talk about the lawlessness in our cities. At no point did he talk about the wars around the world. All he did was talk about himself.
And I will say, Ben, being in that room, what stood out to me was there were people there who were really excited about it, but it wasn't fervor. And it certainly wasn't the numbers compared to the GOP convention that I was at in Anaheim last fall. I mean, not only were there thousands of people who had paid money. Last night in Hollywood, Nikki Haley's event was free. These were people who had paid a lot of money. It sold out immediately. And then outside the convention center in Anaheim, people who spent hours with their like the Beatlemania kind of fandom that surrounds Donald Trump. I don't know how Nikki Haley, doesn't matter how much money she has, doesn't matter the point she's making. I think that is impossible to compete with.
And I think that for years, since he ran in 2016, there was this belief that there is a silent majority of the Republican Party that is disgusted with Donald Trump. And we're in this moment. So much of this primary was about like waiting till that moment where all of the anti-Trump candidates consolidated and one of them could take him on. Yeah. And we're there and it's not working. Yeah. And I think there needs to be, and there has been, an acknowledgement that Trump, the Republican Party is Trump and Trump is the Republican Party. And that this isn't about conservative ideology anymore. This is about a popularity with a single person, despite all of the indictments, the controversies that swirl around him. This is who they want to run. And there's plenty of polling that shows that in a general election, Nikki Haley can beat Joe Biden.
And the only one who can beat Joe Biden.
Yeah, exactly. And that doesn't matter to people. And that's a reality that certain members of the Republican Party have to kind of like reckon with. And a lot of those people are in California. I mean, I think about the fall and last year, we saw Ron DeSantis here fundraising. There are power brokers in this state who have really been trying for a long time to look past Trump and can't because he remains the most popular person in Republican politics.
Yeah, the gentleman who introduced Nikki Haley at this event in Hollywood actually was from Orange County.
Yeah.
Maybe that was part of it. And he's the chair of the Orange County Republican Party. He said his wife's a Democrat. They're talking and fighting about this stuff. And he made it very clear. He's like, I voted. It's what you hear all the time. I voted for Trump before. I don't think he's the guy now. Don't think he can win. That's why I think we need Nikki Haley. What I really wonder is if and when it becomes that contest between these two guys, what is going to happen to all those California voters?
And just to
what
bring
are they going to do?
Just to bring it back to, just about Steve Garvey one more time. Steve Garvey voted for Trump twice, but when asked now, would he vote for him a third time, he's really evasive about it. But I think it underscores what you're saying is like there's a lot of Republicans who are struggling to sort of ignore, look past everything about Trump. And to your point about what happens in California, I mean, it matters very little to the top of the ticket. Joe Biden will win the electoral votes in the fall in California, but it could affect House races in Orange County, in the San Joaquin Valley, in Santa Clarita, where Mike Garcia is running against George Whiteside. Yeah. The more, this sort of needle these candidates like Michelle Steele and Young Kim and Mike Garcia and David Valdeo have to like the thread because of Trump's sort of alienating more middle-of-the-road Republicans is a really, really interesting thing to watch and will probably influence who controls the House next year.
Ben, we know about these House races. We know about the latest twists and turns of the presidential race. We know about so many things because of journalists like you, journalists at the LA Times. We've talked about it many times on this podcast before. It has been a very hard time to be a journalist. 600 journalism jobs lost in the month of January alone. Significant cuts at your newspaper. And I just want to say on behalf, as a reader and a subscriber, which is really important.
Everyone go subscribe, please.
Please. I just want to say how much I really feel for you because I think all journalists know it's really hard to do what we do as it is in this world, to do it under the threat of not knowing whether you're going to be able to pay your rent or, feed your kids is a whole other thing. I don't want this to become a pity party. What I do want to talk about, because I think there's I find myself having real sadness about this industry of course, as a journalist and for all my friends who are journalists, because I want us to be employed. But there's a bigger picture, too, which is how do we understand the world of politics in a world where, if you want to call it traditional media, legacy media, whatever you want to call it, when that is shrinking, what's the ripple effect of that? And I'm curious how you and your colleagues at the Times are talking about it.
Yeah. I mean, look, I have not a lot of very well-formed thoughts about this because we're still kind of just reckoning with losing over 100 colleagues. Yeah. It's been really tough. Again, we are a business and we have an owner who has made it clear that he's unwilling to lose a certain amount of money. He's very wealthy and he's done a lot that's been very good for the paper. Yeah. And so kind of reckoning with that. But I mean, I think the broader point, there is innumerable studies that, not innumerable, you can count them and find them, you should, but that show, directly link the loss of journalists to rise of corruption, the loss of journalists to the rise of how much municipal bonds cost. Mm-hmm. These key bulwarks of democracy, and not to get too either maudlin or high-minded, but that people want to know what's going on. And if they don't, partisanship rises, rancor rises. And I have no solutions other than I hope people subscribe. I know that there's a lot of efforts. I think there was a great article in New York Magazine this week. It's an excerpt from Kara Swisher's book, sort of about
how we got here.
And I do think it's instructive because it really speaks to, Kara Swisher likes to say that she saw it all coming, and God bless her. But more this idea that we can't just say this is about market forces and we're not doing a good job, covering the news. We have been subsumed by technologies, a crowding out of the ad market by Facebook and Google that are very real. And we have to think the paradigm has changed. It's not just about businesses being run better. And some companies have succeeded, whether you look at the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. They have found a way to move forward where they have tons of subscriptions, but they're not speaking to a local audience in the way that, your news channel does or my newspaper does. And there's a cost to that. And they shouldn't be, I'm not criticizing the New York Times, but it's just they're doing a different thing than what I do or you do. Yes. And I hope we can find a way forward. There are alternatives, whether it's nonprofit media, which is not a smooth pass. We've seen layoffs at places like the Texas Tribune, which is a massive nonprofit in Austin.
KCRW and LAST.
Yeah, exactly. So we have to be looking at everything that's on the table and not sort of, there's always been this blanching of whether more government intervention could be involved. Oh, but we cover government. We can't not do that. I think we have to sort of dispense with a little bit of some of our discomfort with that at this point.
Or get the tech bros to play. A great piece. I'm going to give another shout out to your colleague at my former journalism school colleague, Anita Chabrier, who wrote a piece this week pointing out that the tech companies like Facebook and they have been putting out journalist stuff without paying for it. There is some legislation in the works that could change it. It's a fascinating read. I encourage you to check it out, and I encourage you to keep reading and, again, subscribing to the LA Times so you can read great pieces by Ben. It is so great to have you here. And, Ben, if folks want to follow you in those tech spaces that just put things out for free.
You can follow me on Twitter, Boreskes, and, just read the LA Times and make your voice heard, and please go vote.
Yes. We'll be here next week with more news on the media front. Until then, stay safe and be well.
Thanks.
The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Our senior digital producer is Yasmin Cruz. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor, and the executive in charge of production is Daisy Espinoza.